Time to begin, and we are certainly grateful for the opportunity to be together, to worship. And we've come to the end of Nehemiah, almost. We're in the toward the end of the book, if I can get all my papers here, all my ducks in a row. I couldn't help but think as I was studying over for our class this morning about the dedication of the walls, and I was reminded back in chapter 3 of all the walls that are the 10 walls that are mentioned, and how those walls will play a part, actually in the New Testament. And we'll say more about that maybe when we get to it. But if I can come back in my Old Testament and find Nehemiah, Brother Charlie, that's a big deal here. All right. Glad we can be together. Adriana is out. Will be out this weekend. I think she's off school tomorrow. Lee is not well, and I know whoever's making announcements will have more people to announce about a little bit later. In our readings, Wednesday was the 16th, and that's number 47 on our reading schedule, which takes us through Numbers, the 13th chapter. Well, remember, Numbers is about the numbering of the people, the organization of the people, and there are actually two censuses. Two censi, would it be, Landon? Two censi, plural in the Latin. One is, when they came out of Egypt, and so you have 603,550 mentioned, men able to bear arms and so on. Then you had a second census at the end that shows really that first generation had what? It died out. And so in a sense, the book of Numbers has several themes, but one is that God is organizing his people. The way they would line up around the tabernacle was significant. The work of the priest, various offerings. And then we have chapters 1 down to 10, verse 10. They're still at what location geographically? We're at Mount Sinai, that's right. And we pointed out earlier that if you go from Exodus, the 19th chapter, when they come in 3 months from Ramses in Egypt to Mount Sinai, then they stay the better part of a year. So you've got Exodus 19 through Exodus 40, all of Leviticus, and the first 10 chapters of Numbers that incorporate about a year. And it's interesting that in chapter 10, verse 11, the cloud moves and they begin to leave Mount Sinai. And really, this section takes us down to chapter 21 when they will go to Kadesh Barnea, send out the spies, and then for the rest of the time, they'll be wandering in the wilderness until they come to the plains of Moab in chapter 21. And then in 22, so 10 verse 11 through chapter 21 is what some call the tragic transition. You have the old generation or the first generation, then the transition where God allows that generation to die out who disbelieved. Then in 22 through the end, you have a new generation. And we have the cursing of Balaam. We have other things that are going on. And then we come to the end and the speeches of Moses in Deuteronomy. But real quickly, let's go through. In these sections, we want to remember also that in Numbers, we have various laws given. I was in Nehemiah, wasn't I? I had a hard time finding Nehemiah. Let me come back with you to Numbers. In 13, they come to Kadesh Barnea, and they send out what? The spies. They return in 14, and what happens? They're cursed. Down in 14, 29, 30, 31 is when God says you're going to, and then 33, your children shall be wanderers in the wilderness 40 years, shall bear your whoredoms until your dead bodies be consumed in the wilderness. So it was a year for a day. Now, in chapter 15, it's interesting that we have some laws, really 15 through 21. You have laws, and just a little bit. It's interesting. This is a great teaching point when we're talking with children or maybe young people. When they're introduced to ideas, well, the Bible doesn't even mention this historical event or that historical event that might have been known in Egyptian history or Mesopotamian history or somewhere else. The quick answer is the Bible's not written to give every historical fact. It's a specialized history. And you see that here in these passages. Really from chapter 10, verse 11 on through, you have just a smattering of their encampments that are given and some various laws, like in chapter 15. Various laws concerning offerings are given. I'd like for you to drop over to verse 27. If a person sins unwittingly, American Standard says, how does yours say? Unintentional. There's a contrast between unintentional sins, and there's sin offerings for that, and then drop down to verse 30. But the soul that does something with a what? A high hand, or what does yours say, Farron? Presumptuous sins. That is, it's wrong, you do it anyway. There is what? Is there a sacrifice? No. And it's interesting, verse 31, because he has despised the word of the Lord and broken his commandment, that soul shall be utterly cut off. I have found this for a number of years to be just past fascinating to me. You have the idea of the sins, unintentional, then intentional. And then he says, you've despised, you've insulted God, basically. And then in 32 through 36, he gives an illustration of how that was done. There was a man who did what on the Sabbath? He picked up sticks on the Sabbath day. They weren't certain how to deal with that, so they put him in ward. They took the case before God. God said, take him out of the camp and do what to him? Stone him to death. And I think there is a tremendous parallel between there and in Hebrews, the 10th chapter, where he says, a man that set it not or despised Moses' law died without mercy at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. Of how much sore punishment, think ye, shall he be judged worthy? Who hath counted the blood of the covenant an unholy thing, done despite or insulted the Spirit of grace. That's verse 26 and 27. That's right after verse 25, where he said, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as a matter of some. It's interesting, the Sabbath is brought up as a case point or of a violation of the Sabbath everybody should have known. Hebrews 10:25 would include the Lord's Day and the Lord's Supper because he's just said, you do despite unto the Spirit of grace, count the blood of the covenant an unholy thing. Well, what's significant about that? When you eat the Lord's Supper, you're remembering the blood of the covenant. This is my blood of the new covenant, which was shed for many to the remission of sins. All that, you see? So there's a parallel. Here's the Sabbath day, and he calls this a high-handed or presumptuous sin to violate the Sabbath. And then in Hebrews 10:25, you've got the first, included would be the first day of the week, things we do, including the Lord's Supper, and then 4, a man that set it not Moses' law. He refers evidently to this very idea and then goes on with that. I just find that just extremely fascinating. Yes, sir, Brother Gene.
The American Standard uses the word defiantly.
Defiantly, yeah.
That kind of rings clearer.
Yes, than unwitting or high-handed, yeah. The American Standard says high-handed. Some of the others say presumptuous. And then, Brother Gene, what was that? The New American Standard. Yeah, defiantly. I know what it says, but I'm going to do this anyway. It was like if anybody should have known any laws, it would have been the Sabbath. If any Christian should know any laws of the Lord, it ought to be what we do on the first day of the week. And so there's some connections, I think, there. All right, in 16 and 17, we have 2 ideas. There is a revolt against whom? Moses and Aaron. You take too much authority for yourselves. What happened to, well, who leads in the revolt? Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And what happens to them, their families? They're swallowed up in the earth. And then in 17, there is really a revolt against whom here? Aaron. And so there's a miracle that has applications even later on. He takes in order to show that God was pleased with the Aaronic priesthood and all that, he took a what? He took a rod, and it was doing what? What was it? It was budded. And what was that, Brother Gene? Well, yeah. In this case, what's that? The buds, yeah, continue to bud, and then yes, and so indicating that God's authorized priesthood was through Aaron, and then in 18 and 19 there are various laws relative to the rights of priests and Levites. You'll notice in 18:7, thou and thy sons with thee shall keep your priesthood for everything of the altar, and for that within the veil ye shall serve. I give you the priesthood as a service of gift. And we'll see that in Nehemiah when the problem really in the end of 12, and then it comes again in 13, is what was not being done. Exactly, Farron. They were not taking care of the Levites as they should. And so this was a part of it here. And in 19, we have various, the water of purification. In 20, they come and they have a problem. They ran out of what? Water. And this is where God says to Moses, I want you to do what? Speak to the rock. And instead, he strikes it. And, yes. And then down in verse 12, because you believe not in me to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel. That's a powerful verse there. Therefore ye shall not bring this assembly into the land. You didn't sanctify me. You did not set me apart among the people, which means when we disobey the Lord, we are actually failing to put him out as first. That's among other things. That's in 20. And then in 20, I'm sorry, yes, sir. Yes. Yes, yes. You know, there's a lot we could say about that in a good way. And you're exactly right. I was thinking on the way over this morning that I think sometimes people, it's kind of elite spiritual people, maybe they think that in their minds, that God and I are just on such good buddy-buddy terms. It's like whatever I want to do, God understands, you know, that's okay. No, in a sense, God's fair. I mean, God's fair to everybody, and he treats everybody justly. And if I take his word and law fast and loose, he's going to treat me just like he treats anybody else who's been rebelling against him. I think it's interesting in this passage in Numbers, and then the parallel passages that talk about Moses' disobedience. God tells Moses, because you disbelieved me. You disbelieved. We may have a life of faithfulness, but on occasion when we just knowingly disobey God, it's a case of what? It's a case of disbelief. We just don't really think God means what he says. And so that's in chapter 20. Yes, that's right. Right.
I always think verse 10, you know, in this chapter, when he's, you know, talking to people, you know.
Hear now, ye rebels.
If we bring you.
Yes.
You know, that focus on that, like you said, that elitist.
Yes.
Type
Yeah.
attitude.
Yeah, I think that's right. All right, and then we go down to, I'm doing it. I'm doing it. In 21, they go on, they continue the journey. They have they're murmuring, and God sends out what against them? And following there. Snakes. Bites them, and then Moses is told, I want you to take a brazen snake on a pole, hold it up, and everybody who looks on it will what? They'll be saved. They'll be spared. And boy, that is used in the New Testament in the book of John. John 3:14 through 16, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. It's mentioned again, really, and alluded to in chapter 8 and chapter 12. The Son of Man is lifted up, and who will ever look on him, and it's more than just a glance, looking on him in the sense, I believe him. I believe this is my answer. I'm going to follow him with all my heart. then we can be saved. So you've got, and somebody says the Old Testament and the New Testament just kind of put together by some people who are hallucinating. You couldn't make it up. You could not write a sequel that would, with all the parallels, types, and shadows that are here. Okay, and then in 21, 22 are for today. Let's stop that. Patty had mentioned some time back, several months ago, if I could use Sunday's reading, since some people don't read on Sunday mornings, if we could make an effort to conclude that Wednesday night. By the way, David is pretty sick with COVID, but he's doing better. Went to the emergency room and was given a little bit later, a day or so later, the monoclonal antibodies. So he's doing a little better, but he's been extremely sick. So I know I'm barging in on people who making announcements, but anyway, that was on my mind. Okay. God specified it this time. Yeah, He specified it, and it would. And you know, a little later, that's a good question. A little later, they wanted to take it and make an idol out of it, and so you know, it was destroyed. So down during the divided kingdom. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. It's like here is I want you to do this, and then people, instead of honoring God, instead of just the action, instead of honoring God for giving them, they're honoring the serpent, or the brazen. Yeah. Okay. All right, let's go on to Nehemiah. You look like you wanted to say something. Okay, let's go ahead, and we're in Nehemiah. I'm just really I'm enthralled with our study together. It's just doing me a lot of good. Hope it is you. All right, we have Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. This time after the what? After the after the return. So you have the captivity, then the return. I guess this would be the return instead of after the return. So you have the captivity, then the return from captivity, and we have, you know, we've already covered the captivity prophets, or some call them exilic prophets, and now you got pre-exilic, pre-Babylon, then the exilic prophets, exile, Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Lamentations. Then you've got the post-exilic prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, and then the history that we've studied, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. So that's where we are. And then we'll want to remember the basic outline of the reconstruction of the wall in the first 7 chapters, and the restoration of the people, which is where we are now. In chapter 8, they read the law. They become extremely what? Sad because of their sins. And so in 9, there's a tremendous prayer, and in it, basically, they confess their what? Their sins, their national sins. And then in 10, they determine we're going to recommit ourselves, the renewal of their covenant. And then in chapters 11 through what we covered Wednesday night, there's the genealogy of the residents of Jerusalem, as well as names of others. We've already covered that. I want to just come right down here. The effort to increase the Jerusalem's population. Remember what percentage was it that they cast lots for, or they cast lots and then people would come in? Somebody said it. 10%. Yeah, well, a tenth of them would come in. And then we have the listing of these Jerusalem residents by their families. And it's interesting, chapter 11 deals with those who were contemporaries with Nehemiah, here around 445, 444 BC. And then in chapter 12, he actually goes back during the times of Ezra, or when Ezra was writing about Zerubbabel there in 536 BC, and those people who originally came from Babylon. And then he fast forwards down, even in the last part, of those people who were, where are we here? the people who went all the way down to basically the time of Alexander the Great. So the listings of these people, Jaddua is the one I was thinking about. And the priest families at the time of Joachim, and then the Levites during the time of Jehoiakim are mentioned. And here's, that was where we mentioned something else. All right, now we've come down to the dedication of the walls. And that's really in 27 through the end. I mentioned it is a people who are being dedicated more than things, and the act of dedication was more spiritual and psychological than physical, though both were at the behest of God. The greatest value of the wall was psychological, as it furnished success and encouragement to a dispirited people. If you can just think of yourself as being there, and here's the wall, and there's a big wide expanse on the wall as it goes back. It's not like we think about a wall being like made out of standard brick, being 4 inches wide, but it was extremely wide, and you could walk on it. And here you are walking, and your mind could just wander back. This is where David was. This is where Solomon was. This is where Rehoboam and Abijah and Asa and all of our forefathers have been. And because of their sins, this has been shattered, and now it's been built back. There could be some emotional ties on all of this, if for thinking Jews, that this is our family. So you have the sentimental attachment. It's national. We are a physical nation, and it's spiritual. It's all wrapped up in there being a theocracy.
The mindset of coming back to that city and seeing the road.
Yes.
And now God has helped us. We've got the wall.
Yes. Yeah, it's all back together now. And we're sorry about our sins that caused it, but now we're back. Yes, good point. After the walls are finished, let's just think about what we've been studying. Back in chapter 6, we have the completion of the walls, the 6th month of the year. And it took how many days actually to finish it once they got started? 52 days. And so after they're finished, there's a general revival among the people that occurred. We've already gone through that, the reading of the law, the confession, and then the renewal of their covenant. Then a need to repopulate Jerusalem took a little bit of time. We talked about that primarily in chapter 11, 1 and 2. And that could explain why the dedication of the walls was somewhat delayed. They wanted to get all of that done before they continued on. So in the dedication of the walls, we have really 2 major events, well 3, I guess. There are 3 paragraphs in the American Standard. He gets all the people together, first of all. And then he divides them into those who will go south on the wall toward the Dung Gate, those who will go north, and then they're all turn around on the map. I take it to be, and I'll show you just a second. They start down here, go this way, and then they meet over here, kind of in the northeastern section by the temple itself. And so that let's just go ahead. It appears that 2 processions, each led by a choir, go in opposite directions along the broad top of the wall, then meet in the temple area for the concluding thanksgiving and sacrifices. Ezra leads one group going south, Nehemiah the other going north. And emphasis is on the joyful praise. Singing is mentioned 8 times, thanksgiving 6 times, and rejoicing 7 times. All right, let's start. Let's go ahead. Any comment or question? Any overview anybody wants to add? All right, let's begin then in chapter 12, verse 27. Read through 30, and what we have there is the gathering together of everybody for this dedicatorial celebration. Lynn, why don't we just start with you? 27 through 30, please.
And at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought the Levites in all their places, to bring them to Jerusalem to celebrate the dedication with gladness, with thanksgivings, with singing, with cymbals, harps, and lyres. And the sons of singers gathered together from the districts surrounding Jerusalem and from the villages of the Neopathites and from Beth Gilgal and the regions of
Okay, that's good. Let's just stop right there. Okay, so everybody is gathered together. It's interesting. There's a type of a summary here, middle part of 27, to keep the dedication with what? Gladness and thanksgiving and singing. This is a grand occasion. God has helped them to do all of this. It's interesting. I know I'm getting the cart before the horse, but if you drop down to verse 43, when they come together in the temple area after they've been marching on the top of the wall, they offered great sacrifices that day and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy, and the women also and children. God made them. This is one of those occasions in the Bible where the cause is actually put for the effect. Sometimes the effect can be put for the cause. God caused them to do that. Really, how? He didn't just make them, hey, I'm happy, can't help myself. God just made me that way. How did God do that? Through what? We just read it down here in verse 27. They to keep the dedication with gladness and thanksgiving and singing, and had instruments. What had God done to bring them to this point? Let me phrase it that way. Anybody? He'd done everything. Yes, he had given them leaders, such as Ezra and then Nehemiah. He had preserved them through Esther and Mordecai. He had used the Babylonians to chastise them, and then the Persians to release them providentially. You can say, okay, all of this. You know, it's interesting that when we come to the New Testament, when the Ethiopian is baptized toward the end of Acts, the 8th chapter, he went on his way rejoicing. Well, in a sense, you know, God is responsible for all that because he knew he'd been studying. He saw, you know, he'd been reading Isaiah. And then Philip begins from the same scripture, preaches to him Jesus. He is enlightened to see how all that fits together. He sees, here's water. Why can't I be baptized? And so he is. And so all of the things that God has done bring about all of this. And they, of course, they cooperated. I think it's interesting. I thought about you, Landon, earlier when I was reading over these musical instruments in verse 27, toward the end. They sang with thanksgiving and singing, and accompanied by cymbals. The American Standard says psalteries. Some say not psalteries, but what? Harps. And then the American Standard says harps, and some of your translations may say lyres. And have you done much reading on all that, Landon? Yeah, imagine you had, yeah. Basically, the cymbals would have been evidently the twinkling thing, kind of like what our cymbals are, wouldn't they?
They can be. A lot of times it was more finger-type cymbals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's big crash cymbals. It's what we make it of today.
Yeah.
A lot of times much smaller.
Yeah.
Much smaller scale.
Kind of like a tambourine almost.
More so.
Yeah. And the difference between the psalteries or the harps and the lyres, just the number of strings on it, isn't it? Yeah, I think. Yeah, a lyre is smaller and a harp is usually larger, maybe has more strings on it. And, you know, I know Landon studied in depth on all this, but even in our country, when you think back on instruments of music, if you have a violin or mandolin or something like that, and you got these steel strings that are finely, you know, and then the ones that are wound by machine and all that, they didn't have all that then. What'd they use? I know if Lee were here, she'd get all over you, Richard. Yeah, they used intestines and sometimes hair of animals to, just like we can actually use a rubber band and pluck it and get, you know, you stretch it and you can make go up in the pitch. But anyway, they had very crude elements of strings that they used, and likely they were a whole lot lower in their tones than pitch than what we have now. But nonetheless, they had those things. I just like to visualize what it might have looked like is if you had this choir, these people singing, and these people are kind of twanging on their instruments, and they're walking on the wall together. All right, then 31 through 37 deals with, well, let me show you the map here. Here is our gate. I was going to get with you, Sandra, and I ran out of time about your drawing that you had. But if you think about, here's the Kidron Valley, the Mount of Olives over here, the Valley of Hinnom or Gehenna here, down in here, and so you have the valley going down, and the walls that we've been talking about in chapter 3. Two groups likely met around the valley gate. That's pretty much understood, somewhere around there. Ezra's group went south toward the dung gate. That's his verses 31 through 37, which is what we'll read. Nehemiah's group north toward the Ephraim, the Old, and the Fish Gate, because those are specifically mentioned. And then both met in the temple area, which would have been somewhere there. So they started here, and they went this way and this way on the wall as they went around to that area. All right, so we have the processional, dedicational ceremonies. Let's read 31 through 37 here. Lindsay, if you would. I'll tell you what, I may stop you, and we might not read all those names, but read 31 and 32, please.
31 and 32?
Right.
Then I brought the leaders of Judah up unto the wall and appointed 2 great choirs that gave thanks. One went to the south on the wall to the dung gate, and after them went Hosea and half of the leaders of Judah.
Okay, and now go on down to verse 36, where it says, with all these men with the musical instruments and so on.
And his relatives Shemaiah, Azriel, Malaiah, Galaiah, Nethanel, Judah, and Hanani with the musical instruments of David, the man of God, and Ezra the scribe went before them. At the fountain gate they went up straight before them by the stairs of the city of David, at the ascent of the wall, above the house of David, to the water gate on the east.
Okay, thank you. Who is the main character that's before them or leading them? Book bears his name. Ezra, right. And so Ezra and his people are going here, ending up toward the water, they're going toward the water gate, and then they come up toward the water gate, and the water gate was right, obviously, around the Gihon Spring. And so the reason for the name, obviously. And so they come there, in verse 37, by the fountain gate, straight before them. And this old area was known as the city of David because it was a smaller city during his time, and it was enlarged during Solomon and afterwards. And so they come up, here are the stairs mentioned. So they come up in this area as they're going up toward the temple precinct. All right, and then 38 through 43, we have the other company. Read with me, guys, verse 38, 30, somebody else read. Farron, 38 and 39, please.
The other Thanksgiving choir went the opposite way, and I was behind them with half of the people on the wall. The one past the tower of the others, as far as the broad wall, and above the gate of Ephraim, above the old gate, above the fish gate, the tower of Hananeel, the tower of the 100, as far as the sheep gate, and they stopped by the gate of the prison.
Yeah, there are two, thank you. There are two gates mentioned here that are not mentioned in chapter 3. The gate of Ephraim in the first part of 39, and then the gate of the guard, or sometimes known as the prison gate, at the end of verse 39. So whatever happens, they go up here to the Ephraim gate is mentioned, and the fish gate and so on. And they're coming over this way, so that describes their part. 40 describes them all getting together. Sister Sandra, if you would read that, 40.
So stood the 2 companies of them that gave thanks in the
Yeah, and 41, go ahead and we'll mention 41 and 42. I wanted to emphasize 42. Pick up on 42 and Uzziah and Jehohanan there. Yeah, just 42, I'm sorry.
And Baaseiah and Shemaiah and Eleazar and Uzziah and Jehohanan and
Malchijah, I think. Mhm.
and Elam and Ezer and the singers sang loud with Jezreiah and their overseers.
Yes, okay. I wanted to emphasize, here is a type of a summary. They all come together. They've given thanks at the house of God, verse 40. And here are some others mentioned. And in the latter part of 42, the singers sang loudly with Jezahiah, their overseer. The overseer would be another name for what? Their director, their band director, so to speak. And I've found it interesting in the New American Standard, there's a marginal reading about they sang loud or loudly. It says they caused their voices to be heard. Do yours have that, Brother Charlie? I know you use the New American Standard. On verse 42, where it says they sang loudly.
It's just as the singer sang with Jezreiah, I believe.
Okay, it doesn't have a marginal reading. I think it's a 1995 edition of the New American Standard. And it has that they caused their voices to be heard. And that reminded me of, I think, just a real valid application. And that is that when we sing, our purpose is not just to mouth a few words, but we are singing for the purpose of praising God as well as teaching and admonishing one another. And so if I'm not singing loudly enough to be heard, I'm not really doing my job. And that doesn't mean we have to be shrill or obnoxious in our singing, not that. But we need to sing out loudly enough to be heard, and that we. And I think there's just an idea that I'm glad to sing to the Lord, and I want people to know that. I want the Lord to know, and I want others to know that I love the Lord. And there are other songs, psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. The psalms, usually of David. Hymns are more stately. Spiritual songs, they praise God. They teach and admonish. You got a number of things that are accomplished in our singing, but it just kind of dawned on me that that's a great lesson for us to sing out. With some congregations I've been in before, it's so quiet you can. I mean, it's like I know somebody told me in a congregation up in Athens. There's a lot of people there, and a fella that I know who preaches there occasionally says, during an invitation song, I'll look around. He says, it looks like at least a third not even opening their mouths. And that's not right. All of us should be singing and praising the Lord, and we want to be heard. Just like singers sang loud with Jezreiah, their overseer, or made their voices to be heard. They offered great sacrifices, 43 says, that day and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. We talked about that. The women also, the children rejoiced, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard even afar off. Could be two ideas here. Both could be intended. One is that they were singing loudly enough, and you had enough of them together, and they had enough instruments that, kind of like a band at a football game, you can be half a mile away on Friday night sometime. I remember Thompson High School had already been built. And my mom lived about 1.25 miles away from Thompson High School. And on some Friday nights when I'd be down there doing some stuff on the house, I could hear the band. I could hear the band. And so that's one idea. And another is that the joy was heard even afar off, in the sense that their joy over what was going on, the influence spread afar off. Both could be true. Somebody, is that you had a hand up?
Right now, they're 40 foot up in air.
Yes.
And so their voices are going to carry.
Yes.
So I got to thinking about that. We talk about how big the wall is. Now you got two choirs walking
Yes.
off of that wall.
Yes.
Now I remember back when those that said, if a fox running.
Yes. Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, the enemy said, yeah, even a fox came up, and here you have groups of people walking on it.
I'm thinking that God was going to
Yeah.
up on that wall.
Yes.
Would rejoice with them as
Yeah.
they making that parade around.
Yeah, it's a big deal. And it would have an impression on the children and others who would be not, you know. I was thinking, as restudying all this, I was thinking that about the only thing I could think that for us might be comparable is a parade. We see the bands marching, everybody's happy, but in this case, you had a lot of people singing, but there's joy, there's happiness because of what all's been done. Anybody? Kirsten, you look like you wanted to say something. Okay, anyone else? Richard? Okay. All right, well, let's move on then, and we'll finish up the chapter at least. The concern over the support of the Levites is at the end. You might say that's not a part of the dedication of the walls. I've included it here. And I think there's a little application maybe. Joy should produce service, and it did. If I'm really happy to be married to my wife, I need to show it in actions. Or if I'm really, as a lady, happy to be married to my husband, it ought to be seen. On that day, it's interesting, on that day, and it's mentioned again in chapter 13, there was a practical outcome. Likely seen was inadequate support for the temple ministers, the Levites, the priests, the singers, and so on. So this is remedied. And notice in verse 45, it's according to the commandment of David and of Solomon. In essence, they're trying to restore all this back to the days of the Davidic and Solomonic empire. Let's read 44 through the end. We don't have too many hard names in here. 44 through the end. Kirsten, why don't you read that for us? All right, thank you. So on that day, you see that, on that day. Then 13:1, on that day, they read in the book of, you almost could put verses 1 through 3 as a part of chapter 12. On that day they continued, and they read from the law, and then about the Ammonite and Moabite should not enter. And that leads to what happens in the next part of 13. So they set men, they appoint men, back in verse 44. They appoint men over the various treasuries of the temple, the offerings, the first fruits, the tithes. And you'll notice at about midway through verse 44, the portions appointed by the law for the priest and the Levites. This was for their what? Yeah, and it would also be for, exactly, their daily bread. It's for their upkeep. We might just say their general support. And for Judah rejoiced for the priests and the Levites that the American Standard uses the word weighted, the last word of verse 44. What does your translation have? Served, weighted. That's an interesting word. What do you call that person who comes around your table when you're out in a restaurant? A waiter. Does that mean he just sits back and does nothing? What's he do? What is a waiter supposed to be doing? He's serving. He's waiting in the sense that we're looking, and we might say on ready, like Cooper would be at a race. He's down. He's waiting for the starting gun. He's waiting right there. The idea of waiting is ready to spring into action, ready to serve. And that's the idea behind waiting. In fact, it's the marginal reading for the American Standard says they're standing. Exactly. They're standing, waiting, ready to serve. And so here, if their lives are given to that, then they can't be busy doing everything else. Well, chapter 13 says that wasn't being done, so they had to go back out in their fields and gather and do all that to make ends meet. So,
Uses the word minister.
yes, service, minister, that's right. Okay, we're going to have to stop, but we'll finish. We finished chapter 12. A lot of applications here, a lot of good things that were going, and then we have his reformations in chapter 13. All right, Lord willing, we'll pick that up Wednesday night. Thank you for your help.